Deep underwater cave systems demand absolute perfection. In an environment completely hostile to human biology, survival depends on a precarious balance of high-grade technology and total emotional control. Explorers like Eric Establie from France and a specialized team of Finnish divers operating in Norway are masters of this discipline. They navigate these extremes using highly specialized life support systems, primarily closed-loop rebreathers that recycle their breath, allowing them to remain underwater for hours. They plan these excursions down to the minute. They calculate decompression debt, gas reserves, and thermal protection with rigid precision. But despite the cutting-edge technology and years of experience, they operate with zero margin for error. The divers are safe in these submerged passages. The equipment functions, the math holds up. But all of that relies on one fragile condition. The alien environment around them must remain completely unchanged. In southern France, the Ardèche Gorge cuts through an ancient limestone plateau, its rock riddled with flooded tunnels, drawing explorers deep underground. This maps the yo-yo depth profile of the Dragonier de Gode cave. The passage dives past 50 meters, rises, and plunges again. Standard procedures don't apply. You cannot swim vertically to the surface. Escaping means tracing your exact route backward through every restriction. Thousands of miles away in northern Norway, the conditions are vastly different, yet equally absolute. Beneath the frozen surface of the Plura pond, the cave drops 130 meters into bedrock. The water remains at a near-freezing 2 degrees Celsius year-round. These harsh parameters dictate the reality of the dive. Whether it is the sheer depth in Norway or the undulating profile in France, the physical rock writes the rules. If a single variable shifts while a diver is inside these passages, the geology instantly becomes an inescapable trap. On the morning of October 3, 2010, Eric Establie swam smoothly through the Dragonier de Gode. He moved past the known limit of the cave at 1,040 meters in, unspooling fresh guideline into unmapped sections of the deep system. The entire outward journey was completely normal. Hours later, his survey work complete, he turned back toward the exit. But roughly 700 meters from the entrance, the passage he had cleanly navigated that morning vanished. A massive wall of gravel and sediment had collapsed from the ceiling, completely sealing the tunnel from floor to roof. He drove his scooter into the loose gravel, attempting to force his way through. But with every movement, the fine silt instantly rose into suspension. The water turned black, reducing his visibility to absolute zero. He spent 2 full hours digging blindly in the dark, burning through the critical gas reserves his rebreathers were heavily managing. Recognizing the blockage was impassable, he wedged his scooter facing the exit as a clear message. Then he turned his back on the exit and swam deeper into the unmapped abyss, hoping to find a dry chamber or an air pocket. The collapse had sealed him in a sensory vacuum. His only logical response to being trapped was swimming further away from his point of survival, into cold, unexplored darkness, searching for a space that might not even exist. 4 years later, on February 6, 2014, the Finnish dive team descended into the freezing waters of the Plura cave. The first 2 divers navigated the deep passages until they reached a narrow restriction in the rock, 110 meters below the surface. The first diver squeezed through. Looking back, he saw his partner, Jari Huotarinen, signaling distress. Huotarinen's heavy equipment had become entangled in the cave guideline. Caught in the restriction, he exerted extreme physical effort to pull himself free, triggering panic. This schematic details a closed-circuit rebreather. When a diver panics, their breathing rate spikes. Carbon dioxide builds up in the loop faster than the scrubber can process it. This breakdown creates a suffocating sensation, forcing the diver to breathe harder, compounding the problem. Overwhelmed by choking on his recycled breath, Huotarinen removed his rebreather mouthpiece to switch to an emergency open-circuit gas cylinder. Instead of gas, he inhaled freezing water. A snagged line deep underground had cascaded into panic. The physical exertion overwhelmed the scrubber's capacity, and the life support system itself became deadly. 2 hours later, unaware of the disaster ahead, the second half of the Finnish team arrived at the 110-meter mark. They found Huotarinen's body wedged in the rock, completely blocking the only forward path. The first diver of this second group, Vessarantanen, had a terrible choice: retrace the deepest part backward with severely limited gas, or force his way through. He spent 15 minutes physically squeezing past his dead teammate. The exertion at depth burned massive amounts of gas and increased his decompression time. He survived, but was forced to surface early, resulting in permanent spinal cord damage. Behind him was Jari Usimaki, alone at 110 meters, looking at his deceased friend in a passage barely wide enough for his shoulders. Usimaki suffered a complete and total psychological collapse. Paralyzed by the scene, he panicked, switched off his rebreather to an emergency gas, burned through it rapidly, and died in the restriction. The final diver, Kai Konkanen, watched this happen. With two bodies now blocking the path, he turned around, swimming backward for 10 terrifying hours to reach the surface alone. At this absolute choke point, the physical confines of the cave forced a total psychological breakdown. For those arriving at the restriction, every available choice guaranteed either death or permanent, irreversible trauma. When Eric Establie failed to surface, a massive international response mobilized in France. Over 400 volunteers, elite British cave divers, and civil engineering crews descended on the plateau, operating heavy machinery to drill down from the surface. For 8 days, they fought the environment. They mapped alternative routes, considered using micro-explosives, and continuously probed the zero-visibility water, trying to bypass the sediment collapse in a frantic race against his theoretical air supply. When two British divers finally squeezed past the obstruction and located Eric's body, they recovered his dive computer. The data recorded on his wrist held a tragic irony. Eric had died on October 3rd. He drowned on the very first day, before the alarm was ever raised. The 8 days of desperate excavation, the international specialists, and the heavy machinery meant nothing. Human urgency and massive surface reasons are utterly powerless against the timeline dictated by the cave. Back in Norway, police investigated the disaster at the Plura River and drew their conclusion. The restriction at 110 meters was simply too dangerous to attempt a recovery. Access was prohibited. The bodies of Jari Huotarinen and Jari Usimaki would be left where they lay. But the surviving Finnish divers refused to accept that. In a display of extreme psychological resilience, they organized a covert 5-day operation, hauling over a ton of equipment through the snow. Returning to the exact restriction where their friends died, they successfully extracted the bodies. It was a staggering act of controlled courage. World-class technology, extensive training, and careful planning are minimum requirements for entering these spaces. But as these events show, survival in extreme environments ultimately relies on something far more fragile: absolute emotional control when the parameters shift. Today, the Plura River continues to flow under the ice, and the Dragonier de Garde holds the water table just as it has for millennia. Despite the rescues, the tragedies, and the immense human effort brought to their entrances, the caves remain exactly as they were: silent, indifferent, and the final authority.